My name is Jemena. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been described with the same three words: dependable, composed, and quiet. I live in Boston now, though I grew up in a family where legacy was spoken about more often than love. My grandfather built a logistics company from nothing. My father expanded it, and by the time my younger brother and I were old enough to understand what inheritance meant, it had already become the invisible third sibling at the dinner table. People usually see me as the calm one, the rational daughter, the responsible granddaughter, the one who never overreacts. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice. I don't forget birthdays. I don't make scenes. That last detail used to be something I was proud of. For 2 years, I slowly began losing pieces of myself. Small things at first, words slipping out of reach mid-sentence, appointments forgotten, familiar routes feel briefly unfamiliar. I told myself it was stress, too much work, too little sleep. I started writing more lists, setting more alarms, smiling through the fog. And all that time, someone very close to me was carefully helping that fog grow thicker. My younger brother had been microdosing my tea with toxins for nearly 2 years. Not enough to hospitalize me, not enough to kill me, just enough to make me doubt my own mind. His goal wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, it was administrative. He wanted to turn me into an unfit heir, so he could manipulate my grandfather's will and quietly arrange to have me committed to a private nursing facility under the guise of early cognitive decline. He believed that if I appeared unstable on paper, signatures could be redirected, decisions could be made on my behalf, and the family empire would tilt in his favor without a courtroom battle. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about perception. About what happens when a woman who has always been underestimated decides to stop correcting people's assumptions. You won't hear shouting. There were no dramatic confrontations in marble hallways, no glasses thrown against walls. What happened instead was slower, colder, documented. I am going to tell you exactly how I realized what was happening, how I confirmed it, how I chose my response, and how silence, the same trait people mistook for weakness, became the most powerful tool I've ever used. I won't exaggerate, I won't glamorize, and I won't pretend I was fearless. But I will tell you the truth. Have you ever felt your reality subtly shifting and wondered whether it was you or something just slightly out of sight? In my family, I was the stabilizer, not the star, not the favorite, not the charming one who could make a room laugh in 10 seconds. That was my younger brother, Daniel. He had charisma that moved like electricity. People leaned in when he spoke. They forgave him before he finished apologizing. I was the one people leaned on. At family gatherings, I refilled glasses before anyone asked. I remembered dietary restrictions. I scheduled my grandfather's medical reviews. I prepared quarterly summaries for the company board when my father's health began declining. No one formally assigned me these roles. I simply stepped into the empty spaces. And once you step into an empty space long enough, people start assuming you live there. To outsiders, I appeared fortunate, educated, poised, positioned to inherit responsibility alongside assets. But inside the family dynamic, I was something subtler, useful. Reliable daughters are rarely questioned. They are rarely defended either. Their competence becomes background noise. Daniel would tease me gently in front of others. Zemena triple checks everything. She'd audit Santa Claus. Everyone would laugh. I would smile. It sounded harmless, affectionate even. But over time, the subtext sharpened. If I corrected a detail, I was rigid. If I hesitated before agreeing, I was overthinking. If I expressed concern about a rushed financial decision, I was stress-sensitive. He never attacked directly, he reframed. When I began forgetting small things, a misplaced email attachment, a repeated question, he was the first to notice. Not publicly, just in passing. "You already asked me that yesterday," he'd say lightly. Or, "You've been so tired lately." At first, I appreciated the concern. I had been tired. Caring for our grandfather while overseeing operations wasn't light work. Stress explains many things. But what unsettled me wasn't the comments. It was the timing. The lapses were unpredictable, not consistent like normal exhaustion. Some days I was sharp, precise, energized. Other days I would lose a word mid-sentence, a word I knew intimately. I adjusted quietly. More notes, voice memos, structured routines. I told no one I was worried, because I wasn't exactly. I was confused. In our family, confusion is weakness. Weakness invites support, and support often arrives wrapped in control. Daniel began volunteering to handle more tasks to lighten my load. Board correspondence, certain supplier negotiations. He positioned himself as helpful, generous even. Grandfather praised him for stepping up, and I let it happen because I believed families recalibrate under pressure. I believed loyalty meant flexibility. I believed my value wasn't threatened by a temporary imbalance. What I didn't realize was that a narrative was quietly being constructed around me. The dependable one was becoming the overwhelmed one. The composed one was becoming the forgetful one. The stabilizer was being reframed as unstable, and I was still smiling in every room. The first real cut wasn't dramatic. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in my grandfather's study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, a scent I've always associated with steadiness. I had prepared a revised quarterly projection after noticing a shipping delay that would affect our West Coast contracts. Daniel arrived 10 minutes late, cheerful as always, apologizing to no one in particular. He skimmed the report while standing, not sitting. Then he paused. "Shemina," he said gently, almost tenderly, "you already adjusted these numbers last week. Remember, we talked about this." I looked at him. I hadn't. I would have remembered that conversation. Grandfather glanced between us. "Didn't you?" he asked, not accusatory, just curious. Daniel smiled softly. "It's okay. You've had a lot on your plate." The air shifted in a way that felt almost invisible. Nothing explosive, no raised voices, just a quiet suggestion placed carefully on the table. Maybe I wasn't tracking as precisely as I thought. I opened my planner, my navy leather one that has never failed me. There was no note of such a meeting, no crossed-out projection, no marginal annotation. "I don't recall revising this," I said evenly. Daniel shrugged lightly. Maybe it was a phone call. That was the cut, because phone calls leave no paper trail. Grandfather leaned back in his chair, studying me. Not with suspicion, with concern. And that concern unsettled me more than the accusation would have. The meeting moved on. We discussed logistics timelines, fuel costs, insurance renewals, but something had shifted inside me, a small, quiet splinter. Afterward, Daniel caught up with me in the hallway. "You don't have to prove anything," he said in a low voice. "I'm just trying to help." "Help!" I nodded. "I do know." And I meant it. At least partly. Because at that point, doubt still lived inside me. Not about him, about myself. Had I been distracted? Had I reviewed projections late at night and forgotten? Was I spreading myself too thin between the company and grandfather's medical care? Stress can mimic decline. I knew that intellectually. But the doubt felt curated. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated in small, almost forgettable ways. "You already emailed that client." "We decided against that vendor." "You said you'd handle it yesterday." Sometimes I genuinely couldn't remember. Other times I knew, with unsettling clarity, that I had not said or done what he claimed. But the repetition mattered more than the accuracy. Because once a suggestion is introduced, every future lapse fits neatly inside it. At dinner one evening, Daniel casually mentioned to my father, "Zemena's been so exhausted lately. I'm worried she's burning out." My father looked at me with that same gentle concern. I smiled again. "I'm fine." And I believed I was. Mostly. But I started testing myself in private. Rereading emails to ensure I hadn't duplicated them. Recording meeting summaries for personal review. Cross-checking timestamps. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. That would have made it real. The strange thing was this. The lapses never happened when I worked away from home. Only when I drank tea in the afternoons. Only when Daniel had been nearby earlier. I didn't connect the dots yet. Not consciously. But something inside me had begun keeping score. That first small cut wasn't about numbers. It was about credibility. And once credibility is questioned, even subtly, every silence afterward becomes heavier. I didn't confront him. I didn't defend myself aggressively. I simply began observing, very carefully. The most dangerous shifts are the ones that arrive dressed as concern. After that first incident in my grandfather's study, the narrative didn't escalate. It softened. And that softness is what made it effective. Daniel began finishing my sentences in meetings. Not abruptly, not rudely, just smoothly enough that it felt collaborative. "If what Ximena means is," he would say, then restate my point with slight modifications. Slight simplifications. Sometimes subtle corrections reframed my tone from decisive to tentative. At first, I told myself it was synergy. We had worked together for years. Of course, our thoughts overlapped. But I started noticing something precise. When I spoke confidently, he clarified. When I hesitated, even briefly, he interpreted. And interpretation slowly becomes ownership. During family dinners, he'd bring up small memory slips lightly. "Remember when you booked grandfather's cardiology appointment for the wrong day?" He'd laugh. I hadn't booked it incorrectly. I had rescheduled it after the office changed times, but explaining that detail in front of everyone felt petty, defensive, so I let it go. That's how normalization begins. One uncorrected moment at a time. My father started double-checking my summaries, not overtly, just casually asking Daniel for confirmation after I presented something. Grandfather began thanking Daniel more frequently for keeping an eye on things. No one accused me of anything. They just adjusted around me, and I adjusted too. I started speaking more cautiously, leaving room for correction before it could happen, shortening my explanations, deferring decisions I would have once made independently. It felt mature, flexible, but in reality I was shrinking to avoid friction. There were still days when my mind was razor sharp, days when numbers flowed cleanly and contracts aligned neatly in my head. On those days I almost felt embarrassed for ever doubting myself. Then there were the afternoons. The tea arrived around 3. Always herbal, always poured by someone else if we were home. Sometimes by Daniel himself, smiling, placing it beside my planner like a quiet gesture of care. I never questioned it. Why would I? I began experiencing a specific kind of fog about 30 to 40 minutes afterward. Not dramatic confusion, just slight disorientation. Words take half a second longer to retrieve, a mild pressure behind my eyes. Stress, I told myself, or dehydration, or age. When you are the responsible one, you don't suspect sabotage, you suspect fatigue. Daniel's tone remained consistent, gentle, concerned, helpful. "You don't have to carry everything," he'd say. "I'm fine," I'd answer. And each time, that exchange strengthened the illusion that he was supporting me. But privately, something colder was forming inside me. I began noticing patterns in language. He used the phrase, "it's okay," often when referencing my supposed mistakes. "It's okay, we'll fix it." "It's okay, I already handled it." Language like that subtly reassigns authority. If something is fixed, it implies it was broken. If something is handled, it implies someone failed to handle it. And I allowed it. Not because I believed him entirely, but because confronting vague disrespect without proof makes you look unstable. Ironically, that was the very role being drafted for me. One evening, I reviewed a board email thread and found a message Daniel had sent summarizing a decision. He referenced a conversation I supposedly initiated about stepping back from operational oversight to focus on health and family. I never said that. But the phrasing was careful, not definitive, just suggestive. I read it 3 times, and for the first time, I felt something sharper than confusion. I felt watched. Not in a paranoid way, in a strategic way. I realized then that whether or not my memory lapses were stress-related, someone was benefiting from the perception of them, and that someone was always nearby when they occurred. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. Instead, I did something far quieter. I stopped defending myself reflexively. I began listening. When someone underestimates you, they reveal more than they conceal. And Daniel was beginning to reveal patterns. Small, repetitive, precise. Disrespect had been normalized. Concern had been weaponized. And I was done pretending not to notice. There's a moment in every quiet unraveling when you realize the story being told about you has moved beyond your control. For me, that moment didn't arrive with an argument. It arrived with paperwork. My grandfather had always been transparent about succession. Not in rigid legal detail, but in philosophy. Responsibility would follow capability. Stewardship mattered more than entitlement. He valued clarity. So when I noticed a draft memo circulating among our legal advisors, referencing contingency planning in the event of cognitive decline of primary successor, I felt something settle coldly in my stomach. Primary successor. That was me. The language wasn't accusatory. It was procedural, thoughtful, protective even. But I hadn't been consulted. Daniel had. When I asked casually how the memo originated, he answered with practiced calm. "It's just prudent planning." After what we've all noticed, I thought it was responsible to consider safeguards. What we've all noticed. The phrase was deliberate. He didn't say you've declined. He didn't say you're unstable. He implied consensus. And consensus, once suggested, becomes self-reinforcing. I began replaying the past months through a different lens. Every finished sentence, every gentle correction, every concerned glance across the table. Each moment had been small enough to dismiss individually. Together they formed a shape. I wasn't being openly challenged, I was being quietly repositioned. The dependable daughter was being reframed as the fragile one. The stabilizer was becoming a liability. And in families like mine, liability doesn't get confronted. It gets managed. That was the role I had been assigned, managed. I noticed subtle changes in logistics. Daniel volunteered to attend more board meetings alone. He suggested I take mental health days. He recommended a cognitive assessment during a routine doctor's visit for our grandfather, framed as something we should all do preventatively. The idea was floated lightly. It would reassure everyone, he said. Reassure who? No one had accused me directly. No one had sat me down. The narrative operated through suggestion, not declaration. That's what made it dangerous. If I protested too strongly, I would appear defensive. If I ignored it, the narrative would solidify. So I did neither. Instead, I watched. I began noticing how often Daniel positioned himself as translator. Between the board and me, between our father and me, between legal counsel and me. He would rephrase my ideas in summary emails. He would clarify my intentions after meetings. He wasn't replacing me overtly. He was buffering me. Buffering implies protection, but it also implies fragility. The final confirmation came during a private conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. I had returned home unexpectedly after a supplier call ended early. Daniel was in the kitchen, speaking softly on the phone. Well, sir, yes, early onset symptoms can be subtle, he said. I just want to ensure we're proactive before things escalate. There was a pause. I'm not trying to take anything from her. I'm trying to protect the company. Protect the company from me. That was when clarity replaced doubt. This wasn't accidental narrative drift. It was structured. And if there was structure, there was intention. I walked quietly back down the hallway before he noticed me. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't shaking. I was thinking. Because if someone is building a case, they believe they have time. And the most powerful shift in any dynamic happens the moment the underestimated person stops reacting and starts planning. I no longer wondered whether I was imagining things. I understood my assigned role. Reliable, useful, invisible, and soon possibly unfit. The question was no longer whether Daniel was reshaping the story. The question was how far he intended to take it, and what I was willing to allow. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, in complete silence. I was sitting alone in my grandfather's sunroom. The winter light in Boston has a particular honesty to it. Pale, unfiltered, revealing. I had my planner open in front of me, reviewing notes from a meeting I barely remembered attending. There were gaps in my handwriting, half-finished bullet points. A sentence that stopped mid-thought. That unsettled me more than anything Daniel had said. My handwriting doesn't trail off. I replayed the day in my mind. I remembered pouring tea. I remembered the warmth of the mug between my palms. I remembered Daniel asking casually if I felt tired. And then nothing distinct. Not blankness, just blur. For the first time, instead of blaming stress, I asked a different question. What if this isn't internal? It sounds dramatic when phrased that way. But the thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt clinical. I stood, walked into the kitchen, and looked at the tea tin. Chamomile blend. One we'd used for years. Nothing suspicious in appearance, nothing unusual in scent. But I noticed something small. The lid wasn't screwed on tightly. Daniel is meticulous. Almost obsessively so. He aligns labels forward. He wipes condensation rings from counters immediately. A loose lid was inconsistent. I didn't accuse him. I didn't even confront him in my mind. I simply stopped drinking the tea. That day. The next day. The day after. Instead, I poured it into the sink when no one was watching. Within a week, the fog lifted. Not gradually. Cleanly. My thoughts sharpened. My recall returned. The pressure behind my eyes disappeared. Meetings felt fluid again. Words came without resistance. It wasn't relief I felt. It was confirmation. I didn't celebrate the clarity. I didn't panic either. Panic would have pushed me toward confrontation without proof. Instead, I conducted a quiet experiment. One afternoon, when Daniel offered to make tea, I accepted. I watched him, not obviously, just peripherally. He turned his back briefly at the counter. A small movement of his hand near the cabinet. Nothing exaggerated, nothing theatrical. I drank half the cup. The fog returned within 40 minutes. There it was. Not suspicion, not intuition. Pattern. That was the moment something inside me shifted permanently. I understood then that this wasn't about sibling rivalry. It wasn't about boardroom influence. It was calculated impairment. He wasn't trying to overpower me. He was trying to disqualify me. The realization didn't ignite rage. It ignited focus. Because if someone is willing to slowly erode your cognition to control a narrative, they are betting on one thing: that you will doubt yourself longer than they need you to. I stopped doubting. That night, I pulled out an old lockbox from my closet. Inside were copies of family financial documents, archived emails, and notes I'd kept over the years, not out of suspicion, but habit. For the first time, those habits felt like protection. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't alert my father. I didn't warn my grandfather. Because once someone crosses into intentional harm, even subtle harm, you don't reveal awareness prematurely. You gather proof, and you make sure that when the truth surfaces, it doesn't sound emotional. It sounds undeniable. That Thursday afternoon in the winter light, I stopped being the confused sister. I became the observer. And observers, when patient enough, see everything. Once clarity settled in, silence stopped feeling passive. It became deliberate. The hardest part wasn't pretending nothing was wrong. I had been doing that for months already. The hardest part was interacting with Daniel normally while knowing he was attempting to erode me, molecule by molecule, in plain sight. He continued offering tea. I continued accepting. But I didn't drink it anymore. I'd lift the cup to my lips, let it touch briefly, then set it down while speaking. Later, when no one was watching, I would pour it into a small sealed container I had started keeping in my desk drawer. At first, the act felt surreal, almost theatrical, but repetition made it steady. Silence, when chosen, feels different than silence born of confusion. It feels grounded. Daniel seemed increasingly confident. With my symptoms no longer appearing consistently, he compensated by referencing past lapses more frequently. "You seemed disoriented last week," he'd remind me lightly in front of others. Last week, I hadn't touched the tea, but I didn't correct him. Instead, I began documenting everything: dates, times, who prepared the drink, who was present, my cognitive clarity before and after. I also scheduled a private medical consultation. Discreetly, without family knowledge. Not because I doubted my health anymore, but because I needed an objective baseline. Neurological screening, blood work, cognitive assessment. The results came back clean. Not borderline, not monitoring recommended, clean. Holding that report in my hands felt like armor. Meanwhile, Daniel subtly escalated his positioning within the company. He attended meetings solo under the pretense of giving me rest. He drafted proposals that referenced continuity planning. He cultivated relationships with legal advisors independently. He mistook my quietness for retreat. That miscalculation gave me time. I installed a small, discreet camera in the kitchen. One positioned toward the preparation counter, not the room itself. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I hoped to be proven wrong. The first week revealed nothing unusual. The second week I saw it. A small vial was removed from the back of a spice cabinet. A measured drop was added to a cup before the tea bag entered. Not every time. Only when he prepared it personally. The footage was steady, undramatic, clinical. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I watched it twice, then saved it to 3 separate encrypted drives. Silence at that point transformed fully into strategy. I researched the compound label visible on the vial. Enlarged frame by frame. It wasn't a lethal toxin. It was a cognitive-impairing substance in small doses, capable of inducing temporary confusion and fatigue, detectable in blood if tested promptly. Which explained the timing. He had chosen something subtle, something that mimicked stress. Calculated. I continued behaving normally. At dinner, I asked him about a supplier contract with interest. In meetings, I deferred occasionally, just enough to reinforce his confidence. The more secure he felt, the less cautious he became. The most unsettling part was how easily he maintained affection in tone. "Get some rest," he'd say softly. And I would nod, because confrontation at that stage would have allowed him to pivot, to deny, to accuse me of paranoia, to accelerate the narrative of instability. No. If someone intends to label you unfit, your response must be irrefutably sane. So I chose patience. I chose documentation. I chose silence. Not as surrender, but as preparation. And in that silence, I felt something new emerging. Not anger, authority. He believed he was weakening me gradually. He didn't realize he was strengthening my resolve with every drop. When people underestimate you, they stop monitoring you carefully. That was Daniel's first mistake. The second was assuming I would respond emotionally. Instead, I became procedural. I began structuring my days with intention. Every interaction is documented. Every anomaly is time-stamped. I kept 2 sets of notes, one in my visible planner, one encrypted digitally. I photographed the tea tins weekly to track subtle changes in placement. I logged when new vials appeared in the spice cabinet and when they disappeared. He never noticed, because I never changed my demeanor. Outwardly, I was still the dependable one. I attended family dinners. I asked about father's physical therapy progress. I helped grandfather review correspondence. I maintained softness in my voice. Inwardly, I was constructing a case. The lab tests became more specific. During one controlled instance, when I intentionally drank half a cup Daniel prepared, I scheduled a same-day blood draw within the hour. The compound appeared in trace amounts, exactly consistent with the timing of cognitive symptoms. The physician asked gentle questions. I answered factually, not dramatically. I didn't accuse my brother. I simply requested documentation. That medical report joined the encrypted archive. Meanwhile, I quietly consulted an attorney, not the family firm's legal advisor, but an independent specialist in fiduciary law and elder estate protection. I presented the evidence clinically. Footage, lab results, documented pattern of narrative framing within corporate communications. The attorney didn't react with shock. She reacted with precision. "What is your objective?" she asked me. That question mattered. Not revenge, not exposure for its own sake. Protection. Protection of my grandfather's autonomy. Protection of the company's governance integrity. Protection of my own legal standing before Daniel could formalize claims of cognitive decline. Together, we outlined steps. Independent neurological evaluation filed proactively. Updated medical records submitted voluntarily. Formal notice drafted asserting my continued operational authority within the company. A quiet review of will documents to ensure no recent amendments had been made under questionable premises. Every action was anticipatory. Daniel was building a case based on perception. I was building one based on evidence. At home, I adjusted small variables. I began making my own tea, casually, without announcement. When he offered, I'd smile and say, "I already had some earlier." Sometimes I accepted and discreetly replaced cups when possible. I removed the vial from the cabinet once, not to confront him, but to photograph it under clearer lighting before returning it exactly as found. Consistency in his behavior revealed confidence. He didn't suspect surveillance because I never behaved suspiciously. He began referencing my supposed episodes more assertively in conversations with extended relatives. I overheard him once telling an aunt, "It's just early signs, we're being proactive." We. The language always included him as a caretaker. I allowed it, because each statement added to a timeline that, when contrasted against my medical records, would expose the orchestration. The most revealing moment came during a private board call, and Daniel didn't realize was being recorded automatically for compliance. He suggested forming a provisional oversight committee in case Semena's condition progresses. Condition. There it was. Not speculation, declaration. That recording was secured alongside the rest. Throughout all of this, my grandfather remained unaware of the full picture. I chose not to burden him prematurely. He deserved clarity, not chaos. What Daniel never noticed was that while he curated an image of my decline, my actual performance metrics were flawless. Profit margins stabilized, supplier negotiations closed favorably, operational delays were minimized. Data contradicted his narrative, and data, unlike opinion, doesn't flinch. Preparation is quiet. It looks like routine from the outside. But inside that routine, I was aligning medical documentation, legal safeguards, corporate governance structures, and digital evidence into a framework that could not be dismissed as an emotional reaction. He believed he was slowly isolating me. In reality, I was strengthening every institutional pillar around me. He never noticed the shift, because he was watching for panic. And I gave him none. The moment of leverage did not feel triumphant. It felt still. By that point, I had months of documentation. Time-stamped footage of Daniel adding the substance to my tea, medical reports confirming the compound in my bloodstream after controlled exposure, recorded statements suggesting cognitive decline before any formal evaluation, and internal communications positioning him as provisional overseer. But evidence alone isn't leverage. Leverage is timing. The private reveal happened in a law office overlooking the Charles River. Not our family's firm, not anyone Daniel had ever met. My attorney had invited a forensic toxicologist and a corporate governance consultant to review the materials independently. I didn't narrate emotionally. I presented facts, video clip, lab result, email thread, audio recording. When the toxicologist confirmed the substance's effects matched my reported symptoms, temporary cognitive fog, impaired recall, subtle disorientation, the room remained professionally quiet. Repeated low-dose exposure over time could absolutely create the appearance of early cognitive decline, she said. That sentence landed with weight, not because it validated my pain, because it validated my clarity. The governance consultant reviewed Daniel's board communications. The phrasing was subtle, but unmistakable. He was laying groundwork, suggesting concern, proposing safeguards, building consensus slowly. From a legal standpoint, my attorney said carefully, this constitutes intentional impairment for financial gain. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize it. She simply named it. That was the private reveal. Not to Daniel, to myself. Because up until that moment, some quiet part of me had still searched for alternative explanations. Misguided protection, panic, fear of losing control. But the documentation removed ambiguity. This wasn't anxiety-driven overreach. It was strategic sabotage. And now I had the advantage he believed he possessed. I had objective medical clearance filed proactively. I had independent experts prepared to testify if necessary. I had digital records stored redundantly and secured. Most importantly, I had a timeline demonstrating that Daniel's narrative began before any legitimate medical concern existed. That detail was critical, because if someone claims to act out of concern, the concern must precede the impairment, not coincide conveniently with inheritance discussions. I didn't feel anger in that office. I felt separation, a clean, emotional detachment from the version of my brother I had grown up with. The boy who used to wait for me after school. The teenager who once defended me against a classmate's insult. The man in the footage was different. Or perhaps he had always been ambitious in ways I refused to see. The attorney asked me again, "What outcome do you want?" This time, my answer was immediate. "I want structural protection," I said, "not chaos." We designed a plan accordingly. A confidential filing to safeguard my decision-making authority. A scheduled independent medical disclosure to the board. Voluntary and transparent. A contingency letter drafted for my grandfather to be delivered personally by me, not as an accusation, but as a documented fact. And one final component, a formal request for an internal audit was triggered by an anonymous concern regarding procedural irregularities in succession planning. Anonymous. Because sometimes truth enters a system more effectively when it doesn't arrive carrying emotion. I left the office without relief. Relief implies something is over. This wasn't over. It was aligned. Daniel still believed he was ahead. He believed my silence was fragile. He believed his pacing was invisible. He didn't know that the narrative he'd been building was about to be placed under light so clinical, so composed, that denial would sound irrational. Leverage doesn't shout. It waits. And I was done waiting without preparation. Now I was waiting for it. There's a moment when you hold undeniable proof of betrayal, where the path splits quietly in front of you. One direction leads to exposure. The other leads to correction. Both are irreversible. I spent 3 nights considering my options. Option 1 was direct confrontation. Sit, Daniel. Down. Present the footage. Watch his face recalibrate in real time. Demand explanation, possibly confession. It would be emotionally satisfying. It would also be strategically reckless. If he panicked, he could accelerate his narrative. Claim I fabricated evidence. Frame my calm as detachment. Portray himself as a frightened caretaker responding to my instability. Once a person has demonstrated a willingness to manipulate perception, you cannot assume they will respond predictably to exposure. Option 2 was immediate legal escalation, criminal charges, corporate removal, public fracture of the family structure. The evidence supported it, but I asked myself something harder. What does justice look like when the harm was designed to look invisible? Daniel hadn't attempted to physically overpower me. He had attempted to quietly erase me from credibility. If I responded explosively, I would validate the very instability he implied. So I considered a third path. Structural containment. Not revenge, not spectacle. Containment. That meant securing the will legally before he could influence it further. Ensuring my grandfather's autonomy was protected by independent counsel. establishing medical documentation that preemptively invalidated any claims of cognitive impairment regarding me, and, most importantly, creating conditions where Daniel's own actions would surface under scrutiny without my emotional involvement. The internal audit would initiate a review of communication patterns and succession recommendations. My voluntary medical disclosure would nullify the decline narrative. The independent expert reports would remain dormant unless triggered. It was the cleanest option. It also required discipline, because choosing containment meant living alongside him a little longer, speaking to him normally, allowing him to believe his strategy was progressing. There is a specific kind of strength in withholding reaction. People often mistake reaction for power, but power is choosing timing. On the fourth morning, I made my decision. I would not confront him privately. I would not accuse him emotionally. I would allow the system, legal, medical, corporate, to examine the evidence without drama. And I would speak last. I scheduled a full neurological evaluation with a highly respected independent specialist and requested that the formal report be distributed directly to the board. Transparent, comprehensive, voluntary. I finalized the anonymous audit request through compliance channels. I arranged a private meeting with my grandfather for the following week, not to accuse, but to discuss governance structure updates. And then I did something unexpected, even to myself. I invited Daniel to lunch. Publicly, casually, he seemed relaxed, confident. He spoke about upcoming board discussions, as if the future were already leaning in his favor. I listened. I asked thoughtful questions. I nodded when appropriate, because by then, I understood something clearly. The person who believes they are winning often speaks more freely, and Daniel did. He mentioned long-term stability planning again. He referenced protecting the legacy from unpredictability. His language had grown firmer. He believed he had time. He didn't realize the irreversible process had already begun. The decision point wasn't about anger. It was about identity. Was I going to respond as the frightened sister defending herself, or as the competent successor safeguarding an institution? I chose the latter. Once I signed the final authorization documents with my attorney that afternoon, there was no undoing it. The audit would proceed. The medical disclosures would circulate. The timeline would emerge. And Daniel's narrative, built slowly over 2 years, would meet evidence built quietly over months. Irreversibility is not always loud. Sometimes it's just a signature placed calmly at the bottom of a page. I placed mine. And then I went home. Once the decision was made, everything that followed looked ordinary from the outside. That was intentional. The internal audit request moved through compliance without my name attached. It was framed as a standard governance review triggered by concerns about succession documentation irregularities. In companies of our size, that isn't dramatic. It's procedural. Daniel didn't question it. Why would he? Audits are common. He likely assumed it would validate his proactive planning. At the same time, my independent neurological evaluation was finalized. The report was comprehensive: cognitive testing, imaging, blood analysis, and executive function assessments. Every metric fell comfortably within the optimal range. Not average, optimal. I requested that the results be distributed to the board with a brief note. For transparency and to prevent any future misunderstandings regarding my capacity to fulfill my role. Calm, neutral, no accusation. Daniel texted me that afternoon. Proud of you for taking initiative, he wrote. This will reassure everyone. Everyone. His confidence remained intact. Meanwhile, my attorney filed a protective notice with the court, safeguarding my grandfather's estate from amendments without dual independent review. It was subtle, but powerful. Any significant changes to the will would now require third-party medical clearance and legal oversight. Not because I accused anyone, because governance best practices recommend it. The brilliance of structure is that it doesn't look personal. It looks responsible. In parallel, I began quietly transitioning certain operational authorities back under my direct signature. Small things first: vendor approvals, compliance certifications, and financial authorizations that Daniel had been assisting with. I cited workload redistribution as a temporary adjustment. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to see me re-engaging, as if it confirmed his earlier narrative that I had been overwhelmed. He misread the recalibration as recovery. He didn't realize it was a restoration. The audit team began reviewing internal communications, including archived board calls and succession planning discussions. Because everything in corporate governance leaves a digital footprint, patterns started surfacing naturally. Repeated references to hypothetical cognitive decline. Preemptive contingency planning was initiated by Daniel before any medical concern was documented. Proposals suggesting oversight committees without formal trigger events. Nothing illegal in isolation, but together suggestive. During this time, I maintained routine. Shared meals, light conversation, occasional laughter. I stopped accepting tea altogether, gently shifting to sparkling water in the afternoons. Daniel commented once, "Giving up the ritual, trying something new," I replied. He smiled. By then, I had already submitted one final piece of documentation to my attorney, the video footage, authenticated and time-stamped by a forensic analyst. We did not release it, not yet, because leverage isn't used at the first opportunity. It's used at the necessary time. The board meeting where audit findings would be summarized was scheduled for the following month. Daniel was slated to present on long-term continuity planning. The timing felt almost poetic, but I don't believe in poetic justice. I believe in prepared outcomes. In the weeks leading up to that meeting, Daniel's tone shifted slightly. Not suspicious, just increasingly assertive. He spoke as if he were already stepping into expanded leadership. I let him. Silence at that stage was no longer defensive. It was controlled. He thought the system was bending toward him. In reality, the system was quietly aligning around the documented truth. No one saw the shift happening. No doors slammed. No accusations surfaced. Just paperwork moving through channels. Reports are being filed. Signatures are being placed. And a narrative, carefully constructed over 2 years, is approaching its first real examination. He still believed no one noticed. He was wrong. The first consequence didn't arrive with confrontation. It arrived in confusion. 2 weeks before the scheduled board presentation, Daniel received a formal notice requesting clarification on several succession-related communications he had authored over the past 18 months. The request came from the audit committee, neutral, procedural, unemotional. He mentioned it casually at dinner. "Standard compliance follow-up," he said, waving his hand lightly. "They're just tightening documentation." I nodded. "That makes sense." He studied me briefly, perhaps searching for tension. He found none. What he didn't know was that the audit review had already flagged patterns, repeated speculative language about my cognitive stability prior to any medical evidence, unilateral recommendations for oversight restructuring, and informal attempts to influence advisory opinions. Nothing explosive, but enough to warrant a deeper inquiry. Within days, the board requested a preliminary meeting with both of us present. Not accusatory, simply comprehensive. They wanted alignment before the larger presentation. Daniel seemed mildly irritated, not alarmed. "They're overcomplicating this," he muttered one evening. "I was trying to protect the company." Protect. The word felt almost rehearsed now. Meanwhile, my voluntary neurological report had circulated quietly. Several board members emailed privately to commend the transparency. One even apologized gently for entertaining unnecessary concerns. I responded with grace. No apology needed. Clarity benefits everyone. Daniel's demeanor shifted subtly after that. He became slightly more attentive, slightly more careful with his phrasing, but he did not retreat. Confidence, once internalized, doesn't dissolve quickly. The real shift began when the audit committee requested access to archived board call recordings, including the one where Daniel suggested forming a provisional oversight committee in case Ximena's condition progresses. That phrase resurfaced. Out of context, it sounded protective. In timeline sequence, before any formal evaluation, it sounded premature. The committee's tone remained professional. They asked neutral questions. When did concerns first arise? What objective indicators prompted contingency planning? Were medical consultations recommended prior to governance discussions? Daniel's answers, I later learned, were measured but inconsistent. He referenced vague observations, general fatigue, informal impressions. Impressions don't hold structural weight. That week, something else happened. The vial disappeared from the spice cabinet. Not replaced, not relocated, gone. He had sensed the tightening perimeter. He began preparing differently, more guarded in conversation, more attentive to optics. But it was too late to erase digital records. The second consequence arrived through legal channels. My grandfather received formal notice regarding enhanced estate protections, requiring dual independent review for amendments. The language was framed as modern best practice, protecting him from undue influence. He called me into his study. Did you initiate this? He asked calmly. Yes, I said. It protects you. He studied me carefully. Not suspicious, but thoughtful. And from whom does it protect me? From future confusion, I replied. On anyone's part. He nodded slowly. Daniel was present for that conversation. I saw the flicker in his expression. Not anger, but recalculation. He was beginning to understand that structural doors were closing quietly around him. Still, there was no accusation, no exposure. Just consequences emerging through the process. Board members began scheduling individual check-ins with me again, discussing long-term strategy directly, without Daniel mediating. Vendor communications reverted fully to my oversight. Financial approvals routed through my signature alone. Authority doesn't always announce its return. Sometimes it simply resumes. Daniel noticed. He became more insistent about collaboration, more eager to reassert proximity to decision-making. But the narrative had shifted, not publicly, institutionally. The audit committee informed him that his succession recommendations would be reviewed further pending clarification. In corporate language, that means pause. Pause disrupts momentum. Momentum had been his greatest asset. Now it was mine. He still didn't know the full extent of what I had, but he felt the ground changing. And when someone who thrives on control senses loss of it, their composure begins to thin. Not dramatically, but subtly. The consequences had begun, and they were unfolding exactly as designed, without noise. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like forced composure. By the time the full board convened for the continuity planning presentation, Daniel's confidence had narrowed into something sharper, focused, controlled, but no longer relaxed. He delivered his slides with precision, outlining risk mitigation strategies, leadership redundancy, and long-term stability models. On the surface, it was impressive work. But context had shifted. Halfway through his presentation, the chair of the audit committee interrupted gently. "Before we proceed," she said, "we need clarification regarding the timeline of your cognitive concern references." The room stayed quiet. Daniel maintained his posture. "I've always prioritized caution," he replied smoothly. "Early awareness prevents crisis." "Understood," she said. "However, documentation shows contingency discussions predating any medical assessment, and we now have Ms. Castillo's comprehensive neurological clearance on file." She turned to me briefly. I nodded once, calmly. No triumph, no commentary, just acknowledgement. The next slide Daniel attempted to advance froze on the screen momentarily. A minor technical delay, but in that pause, the imbalance became visible. He was speaking into a room that had already begun verifying independently. The audit committee continued with measured questions. Specific emails were referenced, recorded call excerpts summarized, phrasing examined. Nothing accusatory, just sequential. The difference between speculation and documented concern became impossible to blur. Daniel adjusted his tone. "I may have overemphasized certain risks," he conceded, "but my intention was protection." Protection again. The word had lost its softness. Then came the moment that sealed it. Not publicly explosive, but internally decisive. The governance consultant, present as an observer, stated clearly, "Succession restructuring based on unverified cognitive assumptions constitutes procedural overreach." Overreach. Not malicious, not criminal, but structurally inappropriate. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at me once, searching perhaps for reaction. He found none, because this wasn't the confrontation. This was the correction. The board voted to suspend all succession modification discussions pending further review. A temporary oversight protocol was implemented, ironically limiting Daniel's unilateral proposal authority until clarity was restored. Momentum reversed fully in that moment. After the meeting, he approached me in the hallway. "You blindsided me," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry. It was unsettled. "I submitted medical documentation transparently," I replied. "That isn't blindsiding." He studied my face, perhaps looking for accusation, for emotional leakage. "I was trying to protect the company," he repeated. I met his gaze evenly. "From what?" He didn't answer, because by then, he understood something critical. The narrative he had built relied on ambiguity. An ambiguity had been removed. The final consequence unfolded days later. My grandfather requested a private family meeting. Not dramatic, not heated, just deliberate. Daniel attempted to propose minor wording adjustments to estate documents beforehand. Procedural clarifications, he called them. The dual independent review requirement blocked immediate modification. Too late. Structural containment had done its work. He could not accelerate what he had carefully paced. He could not reframe what had been documented. He could not undo recorded words. The vial was gone. The tea ritual ended. The episodes ceased entirely, and without them, his story collapsed under its own premise. Panic at that stage manifested as quiet distance, fewer casual conversations, less performative concern, a noticeable restraint in future board communications. He wasn't exposed publicly, he was neutralized procedurally, and sometimes that is far more irreversible, because once institutional trust shifts, it rarely returns fully. He hadn't anticipated my patience, he hadn't anticipated documentation, and he hadn't anticipated that silence could carry structure behind it. By the time he realized, it was already too late to fix. Not because I destroyed him, but because I refused to be quietly erased. The real confrontation happened a week later. Not in a boardroom, not in front of lawyers. In the kitchen. The same kitchen where he used to prepare my afternoon tea. It was early evening. The house was quiet. Our grandfather had gone upstairs to rest. The light above the counter cast that familiar soft glow. Warm, almost nostalgic. Daniel stood by the sink, rinsing a glass. "I know you did something," he said without turning around. His tone wasn't aggressive. It was tired. I leaned against the opposite counter, calm. "Yes," I replied. "I protected myself." He turned then, studying me carefully. "You set my—" "No," I said evenly. "I stopped allowing you to position me. The difference mattered. There was a long pause between us. Not heavy, just measured. He searched my face for anger, for accusation, for pain. I offered none of it. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" he asked. That question almost made me smile, not because it was amusing, but because it revealed something essential. "You were building a case," I said softly. "You don't build cases by accident." His jaw tightened. "You think I was trying to hurt you?" I held his gaze. "I think you were trying to remove me." Silence again. No shouting, no denial explosion, just the weight of a statement neither of us needed to dramatize. He stepped back slightly, crossing his arms. "I was trying to protect the company from instability." "There was no instability," I replied. "There was narrative." The word lingered between us. Narrative. It was the most accurate description of what he had constructed. He exhaled slowly. "You've always been rigid," he said. "Cautious. I thought if things ever shifted, you wouldn't adapt. And so you decided to shift them for me?" I asked, not accusing, simply clarifying. His silence answered enough. I didn't mention the footage. I didn't mention the lab reports. He knew by then that I had more than suspicion. "I could have handled this differently," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed. There was no satisfaction in saying it, just truth. The most revealing moment came next. He didn't apologize. He recalculated. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said calmly, "we operate transparently. You stay within your defined role. I stay within mine. Governance remains intact. And if I don't—" I met his eyes without raising my voice. Then the rest of the documentation becomes relevant. There it was. Not a threat. A boundary. For the first time in months, he looked uncertain. Not about my memory, not about my stability, but about his influence. The power dynamic had shifted fully. Not because I humiliated him, not because I exposed him publicly, but because I removed ambiguity. "You really think I'd go that far?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I picked up the empty tea mug sitting on the counter, the same style he used to serve me, and turned it slowly in my hand. "I think you already did." He looked at the mug, then back at me. No denial came, just stillness. That was the confrontation. No yelling, no dramatic confession. Just two adults standing in a kitchen, aware that something fundamental between them had changed. He understood that I knew. I understood that he knew I had evidence. And from that moment forward, the performance ended. Not because we reconciled, but because illusion had no place left to live. I placed the mug back down gently. "We don't have to destroy each other," I said. "But we won't rewrite reality either." He nodded once. Small, controlled. And that was enough. The confrontation ended without a victory, but with clarity. It has been 14 months since that evening in the kitchen. If you met me today, you wouldn't see drama in my life. You would see structure, stability, a woman who attends board meetings, reviews contracts, and visits her grandfather every Sunday afternoon without fail. From the outside, very little appears different, but internally everything is. For a long time, I believed strength meant endurance, absorbing pressure without complaint, remaining agreeable, smoothing tension before it formed. I thought composure was the same as self-protection. It isn't. Composure without boundaries invites quiet erosion. What changed in me wasn't my calmness, it was my definition of responsibility. I no longer feel obligated to carry other people's narratives about me. If someone suggests instability, I request specifics. If someone reframes my words, I restate them directly. If governance is discussed, I insist on documentation. Not aggressively, just consistently. Daniel and I still work within the same company, though the structure is different now. Oversight protocols remain strengthened. Succession planning is no longer conversational. It's formal, regulated, and transparent. We speak politely. We coordinate professionally. There is no warmth like before, but there is clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is more sustainable than forced harmony. My grandfather knows more than he says. He has not confronted either of us dramatically. Instead, he adjusted the estate structure to require independent medical certification for any future claims regarding capacity for anyone. Not just me. That detail matters. Because what happened wasn't only about inheritance. It was about perception. The most subtle kind of harm is the kind that attempts to rewrite your identity quietly, to suggest you are less capable, less stable, less clear than you are, until others begin adjusting around that suggestion. I don't live in fear of that anymore. I live in documentation, in transparency, in deliberate speech, and in something I didn't have before. Discernment. I no longer confuse kindness with trustworthiness. I no longer confuse family loyalty with unquestioned access. And I no longer interpret silence as weakness. Silence, when chosen, is positioning. If I seem calmer now, it isn't because nothing happened. It's because I know exactly what happened, and I responded without losing myself. I don't hate my brother. Hatred would require emotional entanglement I've already stepped beyond. What I feel is distance. Measured, intentional, protective. The woman who once questioned her own memory now verifies facts instinctively. The woman who once shrank to avoid friction now occupies space without apology. Not louder, just firmer. Identity, I've learned, isn't defined by how others attempt to label you. It's defined by how you respond when they try. And I responded with structure. That's who I am now. Not vindictive, not fragile, not invisible. Aligned with myself. When people hear a story like mine, they often expect a dramatic ending. A public exposure, a courtroom scene, a tearful apology. That isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and in many ways more lasting. A narrative built slowly over 2 years dissolved, not because I shouted louder, but because I documented longer. Because I chose timing over emotion. Because I understood that when someone tries to disqualify you subtly, the most powerful response is clarity, not chaos. My younger brother believed impairment could be manufactured through suggestion and chemistry. He believed credibility could be softened until it bent. He believed that if he positioned himself as caretaker long enough, authority would migrate naturally toward him. What he underestimated was this: truth does not need volume, it needs structure. There is a particular kind of injustice that happens in families. The kind that hides behind concern. The kind that reframes you as fragile when you are simply inconvenient. The kind that attempts to rewrite your identity so slowly that even you begin questioning it. If you are experiencing something like that, subtle dismissal, repeated reframing, quiet undermining, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need to explode to be powerful. You do not need to humiliate to reclaim authority. And you do not need to prove your sanity by reacting emotionally to someone questioning it. Sometimes the strongest move is to document, to verify, to wait, to act once. I did not destroy my brother. I protected myself. And in doing so, I protected the structure he was trying to manipulate. Today, my mind is clear. My role is defined. My boundaries are visible. And the tea I drink is always poured by my own hands. Not because I am afraid, but because I understand the value of awareness. If you've ever felt your reality being gently, repeatedly reframed by someone close to you, how did you respond? Did you confront immediately? Did you stay silent? Or did you choose a third path? I would genuinely like to know.